All right, welcome back. So welcome to the second session. The sliding door has closed, so I'll take that as our cue to begin. I'm Steve Jackson at Cornell University. I'm extremely excited to introduce our second panel of the day and of the conference, Making and Building. It's a very wide-ranging panel, which you will see momentarily, and let me say a few things about it. So this panel explores the evolving identities and ideologies of craft and the craftsperson across an extraordinary range of sites, times, and human and non-human actors. As an STS scholar, I have to get that in or they revoke my license. You will hear reflections on the ephemeral craft of food and cooking as represented in the cultivated oyster and how these may challenge more object-centered accounts of the field. You will hear about a fascinating project and experiment that locates the making of bone china at the intersection of history, chemistry, industrial and organic farming practice, and the contemporary sustainable food movement. And you will hear formulations of craft and craftsperson and their relationship to conceptions of citizenship and social order in 17th century Germany, and the curious but indicative figure of the Kunstkammer, which we will hear more about quite soon. I should note, too, that two of the talks involve food, and we are scheduled right before lunch. And I don't know if that's by accident or by design, but we will try and also be efficient. So the papers are rich and absolutely distinct in their own right, and I'd encourage you to listen to them and hear them for what they are individually. Taken collectively, I think they also pose a series of broader and I think crucial questions, and in fact, questions that have already started coming up in other talks, and I suspect will continue to come up later in the events as well. So what is craft, and who is not a craftsperson? When and where might we look to find it? Where does craft meet and mix with other cultural forms and practices, and what do we make of these meeting points? What is craft standing in time, from the ephemeral to the longue durée? And how might answers to these questions and the affordances of the contemporary moment lead us to study, think, and do craft differently? So I'm very pleased at this point to introduce our distinguished guides through these discussions. Bernie Herman is George B. Tyndall Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies and Folklore at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I will omit his long list of academic accomplishments, but add, which is relevant to the point coming up, that he also grows oysters on the eastern shore of Virginia, where he maintains a library of fig varietals. Tobias Landberg is an organizational biologist who studies functional morphology and evolutionary ecology at Arcadia University. And Greg Moore, our co-presenters, is an artist whose studio practice explores the relationship between ceramics, new media, and a variety of food-based practices from gardening and farming to cooking and eating. And finally, representing the home team, Andrew Morrill is professor and chair of academic programs at the Bard Graduate Center. He has, a long list of academic accomplishments, and I'll note here that he's currently completing a book, as I take it, on early modern Northern European craftsmen, and we'll be hearing discussions of that in Andrew's talk. So with that, I will turn it over to Bernie. And we've discovered that this is how you drive.
Oh, yes. I was instructed. There's never been a machine I couldn't ruin. Oh, too far. There we go. All right. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for this symposium. I always think of the Bard Graduate Center as a big question place, and this is the occasion. And I always think of the Center for Creativity, Craft, and Design as a dynamic creative space, and this is also that occasion. It happens here. And I do want to give a shout out especially to Catherine Whalen, who put me up to this. So, Catherine, this one, for better or for worse, is for you. I'm looking at an oyster, squinting really, maybe a 1/16 of an inch in length. The object, perfectly formed with a deep cut cup and rounded teardrop profile, balances neatly on oyster grower Tom Gallivan's thumb and index finger. It is an oyster. It is a made thing. It is a crafted work subject to curation that begins with the eye and ends on the palate. It is an artisanal object devoured in its final reading, an act of complete and utter translation. It is known in its first writing as memory, centered on a perfection of place, assayed through connoisseurship, reprised as narrative, deployed as distinction. The cultured oyster is the craft we eat. The wild-caught, natural oyster, wrapped and spat, bent, twisted, and barnacled, misshapen, is not. In an era when popular commodity culture embraces tropes of craft beers and artisan breads, we have an opportunity to expose unarticulated ideologies about how some craft objects, for example, yeast rolls or fritters or oysters, afford alternative vantage points for posing big questions surrounding aesthetics, ephemerality, discernment, and marketplace in the production of identity and reputation. Mid-July on the eastern shore of Virginia, Mid-July on the eastern shore of Virginia, a long, narrow, sandy peninsula that separates the Atlantic Ocean and the Chesapeake Bay, can be beautiful and miserable in the same moment. I am listening to Tom Gallivan describe how he makes an oyster. It's late afternoon. The day is hot. The overripe, marshy saltwater scent of discarded oyster culls wafts from his shell pile that towers a dozen feet above his packing house and barn. In winters past, Tom's kids sledded down the pile on makeshift seed bag toboggans. We toughen them up around here, he says. Kids or oysters, I wonder. I am taking a break from working on, Tom is taking a break from working on an outboard motor that has seized up. Streaming sweat and grime, he leans against the boat trailer, observing an oyster is a crafted product, and it takes a lot of effort, and there's a lot of different ways to do it like any other craft. Tom reflects. Then he gets to the point. People are carrying on about what a natural product it is and how beautiful the oysters are. And what they don't realize is that when it gets to these little round marbly oysters, he says, alluding to what some growers market as petites or pearls, that's the farthest thing from being a natural product. I lean in as Tom reminds me that the chefs we know tend to respond to cultured oysters as natural objects as opposed to the made things they are. And here is the nub of the craft we eat. It is an assertion of aesthetic value, where aesthetics is defined not by a philosophy of the beautiful, but rather by a balance and proportion of being in the world. When we engage the craft we eat, or craft in general, we are in some measure enmeshed in craft ecologies, craft terroir, and craft theater. The craft we eat, arguably the largest and most varied universe of made things, invokes registers of natural history, gastronomy, commerce, agriculture, and etiquette, broadening our reflections on the worlds of made things. Tom Gallivan gives us a sense of the mechanics of production as a sequence of interventions in crafting or shaping an oyster. Spawning them in an artificial environment, he begins, we get oysters to be single oysters. Then they're placed in a downweller and they're gently washed. He walks through a mental checklist. At that point, you might be partially shaping them, but that's not the intent. Now I've lost my place. But that's not the intent. It's just to keep them clean. Once they get them outside onto raw water and they're in an upwelling system, he can, you know, if this language is foreign to you, it's true, but don't ask me about words for crabs. He continues, after they get a little size on them, they show up and they're 1 millimeter. You maybe run them a week or so, maybe 2 weeks. His production narrative gathers speed. Then you really start to swirl them around and blast them a little bit more with a hose to break them up and impart a rounder shape to them. You place them out in bags once they get up to a size where they catch on a 1/4-inch mesh or into a floating down upweller system so we can grow them out a little bit more. Again, they're blasted and washed and tumbled. The whole time you're chipping the bill and imparting a shape to them. Then they go out into the Chesapeake Bay in bags. About once a week, we actually shake them. We're shaping that edge, and they're not getting elongated. They're getting more round. We're not letting them grow skinny and long, he says, dismissing wild brush oysters, because there's a less desirable shape in the marketplace. It's a characteristic that appears when you have them at high density in nature. That's how we make oysters, Tom presses on. We just handle them a lot. And then at a certain point, too, we go through a culling process that's all done by hand. After all that handling, they're selected out by eye. Some of the ones that are less desirable in shape are tumbled down the machine again and have the bills beat on them and shaped once again. Sometimes we transfer them to a different location where they might grow slower or might grow faster. That environment might impart a little bit of shape on them. It's a long process that involves a lot of handling. That's how we make an oyster. That's acceptable to the market. When I think of cultured oysters, I think of craft ecologies, beginning with an understanding that ecologies are organic systems of relations mapped by mutuality, interdependency, and environment. If an ecology is a system of interactions between organisms and their surroundings, then we might consider a craft ecology as a network of relationships between people, objects, and processes that come together to constitute a particular universe of made things. The complexities that mark those things are in constant negotiation. Craft ecologies quietly manifest ideologies of the everyday through the subtle operations of networks defined by what Robert St. George presented as the poetics of implication. Objects, craft objects in this instance, I'm thinking of Tom's oysters, render visible underlying chains of habit, value, and assumption that reify and inscribe the idea of craft as an ideological construction. When it comes to crafting oysters, Tom summarizes a labor-intensive collaborative process driven by contextual opportunity and empathy for materials. An oyster, he says, even though we've cultured them, use the word cultured, he emphasizes his word choice, even though we've cultured them for a number of years now, from the standpoint of genetic homogeneity, you still are dealing with something that has drastic variations. Tom stresses the seeming intractability of his medium, oysters, relative to a market-based desire for uniformity, not in flavor, but rather on appearances. Market is central to craft ecologies. We are, however, left to discover for ourselves the parameters and significance of an ideology of uniformity in the craft we eat. But that's a project for another day. Located in craft ecologies, the craft we eat introduces questions of identity and local knowledge around the notion of terroir. Defined by easy habit is the taste of place. In its food-centric application, terroir offers a means for framing and explaining people's relationship to the land, be it sensual, practical, or habitual. Craft terroir, by extension, offers a means to frame our conversations around made things in their generative and consumed geographies, offering a link to craft ecologies, but with the added quality of acquired knowledge of distinction of place and consumption as a representation of social capital, steeped in visible performances of connoisseurship and curation. Craft terroir defines the particular attributes of place embodied in made things and narrated through words, actions, and objects. We ingest and digest terroir. We curate, collect, and display craft terroir. In doing so, we imbue ourselves with the tastes and sensibilities of identity and authenticity. Our bodies literally absorb terroir, and we translate its substance into narratives of place and experience, capturing a consciousness of association and belonging. Place alone, however, fails to translate the deeper associations that craft terroir projects about identity. That is the work of craft ecologies. Craft terroir is experience and emotion, embodiment and immediacy, custom and invention, destiny and storytelling. When we invoke the idea of craft terroir, we speak of ourselves. Tom positions his commentary around design. You try and get your oysters as uniform as possible. It's funny. You put a box of oysters out that are big, and you can put a box of oysters out that are small. But if you put a box of oysters out that has big ones and small ones in it, the market is going to bitch about it. You're going to get complaints. You can have a mixed box, which is not always desirable because, Tom emphasizes, when chefs put them on a plate, they want everything to be exactly the same size. Craft terroir comes into play in the instant of consumption and the translation of the made thing from sensory experience into sensible narrative. Tom's conflation of process and culture in crafting an oyster speaks directly to a core characteristic of craft ecologies, the interaction of makers and media around desire, expectation, and market. Accordingly, we know craft ecologies and craft terroir through objects as the indices and loci of process and performance. The former focuses on production or the practices of making, the latter on enactment or the theatrical display of ability. Both communicate meaning beyond the immediacy of their occasion. The production process Tom describes parallels techniques employed in other growing geographies. Oyster growers on the coast of Normandy, for example, I have a really rough job. I grow oysters, and I always keep 5,000 to 10,000 on hand for culinary emergencies. Oyster growers on the coast of Normandy, for example, use a rack and bag system that demands constant handling. The harvested animals are carried to packing houses where culling and finishing take place. There, the oysters are washed, sorted, flushed, and filtered with seawater and packed in rustic baskets lined with seaweed. Conveyed to market, the oysters, labeled by variation and locale, are displayed in open baskets, some plastic, some woven wicker. There are even oyster tasting rooms where instruction on the opening and gustation of oysters is taught to audiences rapt with curiosity and hunger. At this juncture, though, I want to concentrate our attention on craft performance in the arena of shucking and presentation. Imperfectly crafted oysters are relegated to the status of ingredient. Tom Gallivan explains. If they're not properly handled, they're of little value, so that's when they're more suited to be something to send to a shucking house. You're not worried about the aesthetic experience of having a beautiful oyster sitting there in a restaurant. You're just worried about frying up some meats and having a little bit of size to them to do whatever recipe you're trying to accomplish. Shucking oysters in packing houses is skilled, routinized labor. There is regional variation in this work, but on the eastern shore of Virginia, the process flows as follows. Runners wheel baskets of oysters into the shucking room and dump the contents onto work tables. The shuckers rhythmically reach into the pile in front of them, bang the bills on a spud, insert their knives, twist, cut, and deposit the oysters into a gallon can at a rate of 7 to 10 oysters per minute. The oysters have to be whole without nicks, belly cuts, or blemishes. The work is repetitive handwork, and the process defies mechanization. Generally, the work occurs out of sight, and the outcome is measured qualitatively and quantitatively as a commodity product. All work requires some level of skill, but we tend to value the work in proportion to the complexity and dexterity of skill witnessed in its application and how we critically position and discern it. This raises a fundamental question at the heart of craft theater. Consider raw oyster bars as theater where actors open oysters on the spot with the carefree nonchalance of practiced and scarred hands. This is a form of performance that is less about the made thing and more about the consumption of enacted craft. The craft theater of raw bars is remarkably consistent across broad geographies, and it introduces a different equation to the connection between craft and place. The geographies and ecologies here are defined not by coordinates of location, but rather by the coordinates of practice. The two can coincide, but they can also manifest independently. I am mindful here of the seamlessness of experience between locales as diverse as the Bastille Market in Paris, the quayside of Cancale, the street markets of New Orleans, and raw bars of Manhattan and Washington, D.C. The locations are distinct and distant. The craft ecologies they entail, though, cohere around the display, application, and connoisseurship of ordinary practice in extraordinary moments. Tom Gallivan, this is to torture you, Tom Gallivan stresses you can't put something that looks horrible on a plate. Thus, in our hour before lunch, we arrive at presentation. Craft theater of this sort often inspires narratives of excess around skill, materials, and acquisition, or, in a word, spectacle. In the spectacle of the craft we eat, the plate is the set piece of craft theater, a terroir and an ecology where craft naturally bleeds into art. The idea that craft can be treated more like art in its reception and assessment is, however, misplaced. Considering the craft we eat, we navigate a confluence of language and things that raises questions about where, how, and why we set boundaries. If we look at the craft we eat in terms of ecological interactions, how these interactions, material, process, production, reception, aesthetic, invoke terroir and theater, we open our imaginations to the transactions and ideologies of craft in everyday life. Thank you.
That's not us.
We
One
can't
trade?
do this one. This could be fun. We could try.
It would be like the Situations 3 where you navigate Paris with a map of London.
That's generous. Cool. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and share our ongoing research. I'm Greg Moore. I'm an artist, and I teach at Arcadia University.
I'm Tobias Landberg. I'm a biologist, and I also teach at Arcadia. We're going to talk to you about the effects of farming practices and animal husbandry on the material properties of bone china. Wait. All right. How do we express human ecological values through the crafted form?
Can we transform our agricultural practices from animal to ingredient and into a material used to craft objects of contemporary art?
What do evolutionary biology and ceramic art have in common? The morphology or form of both animals and pottery are shaped by environmental factors that determine performance and define long-term fitness through evolution and adaptation. We are a scientist and an artist with a shared interest in experimentation and refinement by exploring and studying functional morphology.
Tobias studies the form-function relationships in animals, and I do the same with pottery, or vessels, or ceramic objects. This shared ground was the beginning of a research agenda investigating the biological and elemental factors that shape an historically important craft material, bone china. I think when we think of bone china, we think of this. The fine, translucent, white ceramic ware known as bone china was developed in Europe throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in an attempt to replicate Chinese porcelain. It is a mixture of kaolin, a white clay, and potence, a white china stone, a rotted granite, invented in China well over 1,000 years ago. Europeans spent hundreds of years trying to replicate porcelain with varying degrees of success. The process of experimentation with the novel inclusion of bone ash, the mineral remains of bone tissue after water, organic fats, and connective tissues are burned away, inadvertently led to the invention of a new material, bone china. That's a bone china teacup from the Spode factory in 1820. This is one of mine. Bone china is the only ceramic material comprised primarily from the remains of once living organic tissue, and thereby has a unique potential to express our shared human ecological values. Since its inception, bone china has been used to make objects that express the owner's social status, with laboriously produced, almost ceremonially fine, delicate cups with intricate hand-applied decoration. Despite taking the form of functional vessels, like teacups and plates, bone china has not been the workhorse of the kitchen or dining room. So the historical relationship between bone china and food is tenuous. Over the past 4 years, I've been working with a chef in New York, Dan Barber, in the creation of ceramic tableware for his Blue Hill at Stone Barns restaurant, deepening the restaurant's idea of nose-to-tail eating and carrying the philosophy to and through the plate. This project has included the development of a unique bone china formulation using Josiah Spode's, that was the past slide, Josiah Spode's original bone china recipe composed of bone ash derived from the waste bone of the Blue Hill at Stone Barns restaurant.
So not all bone is created equal. We know that farming practices affect living animals' bone qualities. We don't yet know how farming practices that affect livestock quality of life determine bone china material properties. Our preliminary experiments show dramatic differences in bone china quality using single source, pastured, hormone, and drug-free animal bone ash compared to industrially sourced bone ash that you see here. We don't yet know if this phenomenon is widespread. We're testing the hypothesis that factory farming technology, with its grain diet and little room to move, relative to traditional farming practices with its grass diet and field exercise, changes the bone structure and mineral composition through altered calcium to phosphorus ratios and trace minerals that improve bone china quality.
Going back, it's twice. Bone china made from waste bone, grass-fed organic from the Blue Hill kitchen is whiter, more translucent, stronger, deforms less, and matures at higher temperatures than bone china produced from industrial bone ash. This suggests that the higher quality of life of cattle raised for beef to be served at restaurants like Blue Hill translate into a higher quality of bone china than that made from factory farmed animals.
So variation in bone mineral composition and structure may give rise to the differences we see in bone china produced from different sources of bone ash, because there's abundant variation in bone that might lead to variation in bone ash chemistry. genetic differences between species, and anatomical adaptations of different body parts are likely sources of major potential variation. Bone mineralization increases with body size, but it may decrease with growth rates. The different pressures put on animals that inhabit different habitats select for differences in the material properties of bone, allowing them to bend or stay rigid depending on the functional demands of environmentally relevant behaviors. Variation can come from within a species in different breeds, or even from various conditions that genetically identical individuals experience during their lifetime. Cattle, for example, have been artificially selected for particular traits such as beef or milk production, forced production in farm labor, and even for docile temperament and leather. In the last century, cattle have started being selected for shapes that allow intensive agriculture with animal husbandry methods that allow geometric close packing, tolerance for crowded conditions, rapid growth, and efficient feed conversion in factory farms. Next slide, please. Farming practices are critical cultural legacies and shape local economics, regional ecologies, and even global climate change. The slow food and farm-to-table movements are integral components in the collective cultural response to these ecological challenges. Agricultural and material resources shared across geographical areas and cultures are represented in food and genetic diversity of plants and animals, the technology to produce and reproduce, protect from disease, and manage gene flow. Organic farming practices are not just a holdover from ancient ways, but a restructured ethos in response to the rapid erosion of family farms being absorbed by industrial agriculture. Organic farming encourages conscientious consumers to eat foods produced without pesticides and growth hormones and antibiotics, which affects the farming producers, the environment, as well as the consumer. Is that me?
Yep.
Thank you. The mineral content of livestock bone varies tremendously across species. Parts of the body, sexes, time of the year, age, growth rate, exercise, hormone levels, soil biochemistry, and pollutants. The relationship between these variables and bone china quality is essentially unknown. Therefore, we are controlling these variables and testing whole femur bones, which are readily available byproduct of the beef industry. We've purchased fresh or frozen cow femurs from at least 16 factory farms, sources, and 16 traditional organic pastured hormone and drug-free farmers. The calcium and phosphorus ratios are the primary constituents of the bone. However, we're also testing for trace minerals in order of their abundance from sodium, chloride, sulfur, zinc, copper, manganese, iron, lead, iodine, and selenium, things that are important in ceramics, as well as in functioning animal bone. We expect that factory farm beef bones will contain altered calcium to phosphorus ratio and different amounts of trace minerals. Please enjoy this video of happy cows exiting the farm after a winter spent feeding on grain. Now this is in slow motion, but you can see how much energy they're expending. You can see that they have behavior, they're loading their bones, they are using their body in ways that make their bodies respond to. Strong bones come from exercise. You can't build strong animal bones in a factory farm where animals can't move.
It's a shame to change this one.
It tastes better too.
Touche. Yeah. This is a roasted cow femur for the marrow. Most of the animal is consumed through eating, right down to the bone marrow. One of the only parts of the animal that's not eaten is the bone. This constant supply of waste bone at the Blue Hill Stone Barns kitchen is often returned to the soil as fertilizer and sometimes used to produce bone charcoal-like fuel used to cook food outside. My first experience with bone china, or with the ceramic process, was an experiment in which I took the bone char from the restaurant and built a localized kiln environment in which I attempted to fire a plate, trying to imbue color, texture onto the ceramic object. This is what it looked like in the kiln. The experiment failed. The object was dull and boring. But the residual pile of bones was shockingly white. Pre-firing, post-firing. A color I'd never seen before in the studio or out of a kiln. The bones, in contrast, the bones went into the kiln charcoal black. And after they came out, after the disappointment of the experiment failing, the bones sat in my studio for about 3 months, constantly calling for attention, but I didn't know what to make of them. The moment of discovery occurred in the chef's kitchen during a conversation about ceramics. Of course, bones make bone china. It seems obvious to me now, but it didn't up until then. So motivated by this realization, studio experimentation began to convert raw waste bone into a refined, powdered ceramic ingredient. Cow bones are calcined at about 1100 degrees centigrade to rid specimens of free water and organic matter. The resulting fragile bones are ground to a fine paste using a wet ball milling method. So these are the bones being put into an apparatus called a ball mill, ground into a bone ash paste. It's hard to describe how white this is. It's like if you can make neon white. It glows, very, very white. And then that paste is then dried and ground. And then mixed into a bone china. And as I said before, I use Josiah Spode's original 1799 recipe, consisting of approximately 50% bone ash, 25% china clay, 25% Cornwall or china stone. So proportionally, that's what it looks like. So I really like the subtitle of the conference, The Material Turn. I think what we're interested in here is understanding that if materials have meaning, what's the meaning of a bone china bowl used to serve the animal from which those bones came? What does it mean to serve food in a bowl as such? And what are the differences in the way these animals are raised and the outcome of the object? So we talk about this all the time. This to me looks like an animal in a zoo. It presents the object clearly. You can see its shape, you can see its color, but it looks out of place. It looks caged. They really come to life in the kitchen. So these are the bowls waiting to be plated. There's some food in them. This is like their natural environment. And really they're aesthetic objects, but they need to perform in the kitchen under tremendous stress in an environment that is aggressive at best, especially the dishwasher environment. Okay, so ceramic materials are almost exclusively derived from inorganic sources, but bone china is unique in that it's composed in large part of material that was once alive. These are 12 of our organic, we call them happy cow femurs, before and after calcining or firing. About 2/3 of the mass is lost in this firing process.
So these are test bars, and this bone china material is being measured for shrinkage rate, deformation and firing, translucency, whiteness, hardness, and density. Ceramic quality testing methods include measuring linear dimensions before and after drying and firing, tests for glass formation and firing deformation. Translucency is measured with light meters, whiteness measured against color standards, and hardness using scratch tests, and density measured using water displacement methods. Those are all data that we anticipate getting. The newest results suggest that industrially sourced bone ash may have a mix of animal bones and contaminants that create low-quality bone china.
So what we're looking at here are bars of the three categories of bone china, from left to right: grass, grain, and industrial. Before in the slide on the left, and after in the slide on the right. So you can see shrinkage, discoloration, and deformity.
Yes, that's me. Yeah. As professors of art and design and biology, respectively, Greg Moore and I are employing what the symposium describes as a learning by doing pedagogy. Our undergraduate student researchers are employing the creative and scientific process in parallel approaches in the studio and lab. Shannon McGrath, my student, and Rachel Geisinger, Greg's student, have accepted a great deal of responsibility as they research from primary literature, developing techniques to solving practical problems, and working with collaborators, including faculty and graduate students at Alfred and Arcadia universities. As collaborators across many disciplines, we share common ground in process between the studio and lab, in method, in creation and analysis, and in impact, in meaning and application, as well as in the communication of our results. Our shared ground is in the creation of a new language to communicate meaning in the relationship between humans and our environment.
So we're going to talk about these together. Can you tell them what we're looking at?
This is a scanning electron. This is a scanning electron microscopy image of bone china, industrial bone china, made from bone ash that we bought in a 100-pound bag, 50-pound bag. And so first it is sputter coated with gold, and then put into the scanning electron microscopy machine, and it bombards it with electrons, and those electrons bounce out and reveals that light and dark contrast depending on the way those electrons bounce back to the sensor.
So what we're analyzing is the relationship between this visual and the way it performs. And so this is the industrial bone ash sourced bone china that has a 3-point bending test breakage point of 11,000 pounds per square inch.
Or 80 megapascals for
Yeah.
And this image is at a 250 times normal size magnification.
Okay, so the next one was the grain fed. So these are animals that aren't industrially raised cage-wise, but they're on grain, not free to roam on grass. They're contained on grain. And you can see how the visual changes. We're interpreting the meaning of this. The associated data for the stress failure test increases dramatically. It's so it's 16,000 psi, which is 115
Megapascals.
Thank you. And then this is the grass-fed. And the grass-fed is the strongest at up to 17,000 psi, or 122 megapascals. So we're not exactly sure what we're looking at and how that relates to strength. We know that it does, and we're making that correlation and figuring out the details of that correlation.
So you remember, correlation does not equal causation. So they are correlated. There's lots of things that are different about these different samples. The question is, which ones are causing the differences in the breakage test, strength, in the color, in the glass formation, all those other differences that we see.
Okay. All right.
Go back to the industrial.
Yeah.
Just note these crazy big bubbles that you see, and those are probably it's a pocket. It had to have been filled with gas at a time, and what you see is a really homogeneous background matrix with really large bubbles, and it looks like this is the product of overfiring of the material, and so you get the separation of the dense ceramic material. It's very homogeneous. It's easy for cracks to propagate through this type of material. In contrast, you're going to look at the grass and grain-fed have a much more irregular shaped pockets with various sizes. And it's much more difficult, theoretically, for cracks to propagate through this type of material. Me?
Yep.
All right. In order to get past what we see in the structure and try to understand the chemistry of what the underlying differences are, we're using, in collaboration with a forensic toxicologist and a chemist, we're using atomic absorption spectroscopy. We're dissolving these bone ash samples on your right there in nitric acid and then testing them in the AA machine. We're also looking at scanning electron microscopy and X-ray diffraction. So you can see our students here preparing samples at Alfred University in collaboration with Bill Carty, who is, let me get his title right, at the Center for Advanced Ceramic Technology at Alfred University.
Okay. This is our last slide.
All right. So this is the exciting part. If you weren't excited already, if you didn't like those happy cows, this is the part where we see the X-ray diffraction results, and they're just preliminary results, but we're already seeing differences between grass-fed, grain-fed, and industrial bone ash sources. And you can see that the grass-fed is coming back with a signal of pure hydroxyapatite. It's calcium and it's phosphorus, and that's it. The grain-fed animals are getting signals of portlandite, which is a different species of hydroxyapatite. It is going to impart a different structure to it, and it might be incorporating other trace elements. The industrial bone ash is the one that looks even more different from both of them. And what we're seeing is not only your calcium phosphate, your hydroxyapatite, of course, this is still 99% of everything in bone, but those trace elements can have big effects. And we see calcite and something called Whitlockite. When we came back with those results that said Whitlockite, I said, what's Whitlockite? So I went right to Wikipedia, and what, as you do, I give them money every year. What is Whitlockite associated with? Metabolic bone disease. You get it.
I think. All right.
With that, we just want to thank our collaborators, our student researchers, Shannon McGrath and Rachel Geisinger, and Bill Carty, and Karen Scott, and especially the Center for Craft for funding our work and giving us an extension.
Yes. Great. Now, how do I... Oh, perfect. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. There's no food in my talk, so I hope you'll hold your hunger for lunch at bay a little bit. I'd also like to extend my sincere thanks to Catherine and Alyssa and Marilyn, the organisers, for
the honour of presenting today. And I'm going to be talking very much about a conception of craft that existed before the era of industrialization, and one strikingly different, I think, from many of the, which underpins the majority of many papers in the present conference, but I'm hoping we can draw out some analogies and comparisons from the early modern era. And I want to start with a book printed in, or published in 1779, on the cusp of the modern industrial era and towards the end of a very long craft tradition, which I will explain in a moment. It's by Paul von Stetten, who is a Augsburg German antiquarian, who published a history of craft of the imperial city of Augsburg. Unusual, a dedicated history of craft. Not very many of those around. And in it, he attributes the city's fame to the crafts, its international standing, to a 300 years tradition of craft excellence. The product, he writes, of the craftsmen working together with enlightened patrons and civic authorities, prominent citizens who are encouraged to support and to protect their craftsmen citizens. Von Stetten structured his history into three kinds of production: practitioners of fine arts, the mechanical and chemical arts, and craftsmen engaged with things not just of daily need, but with objects of external trade and luxury. And he has a very broad definition of what craft or Kunst was. It included cabinet makers, instrument makers, dyers, paper makers, metal stampers, bell founders, as well as painters and sculptors and goldsmiths. In fact, crafts, as we've seen in the talks this morning, also involved agricultural crafts, and every form of human activity came under this category in a sense of Kunst. But above all, von Stetten understood and articulated an understanding of craft that was founded upon an ideal of urban community, centered around craft production, of a culture based on a model of household workshops organized by a guild system and around an idea of citizenship. Since its establishment in the 13th century, the Augsburg guild system had remained central to economic and cultural life of the city. The systems of training, let's go on to an image of some of those crafts. This is from Jost Amman's Book of Trades from 68, forgive me. But the systems of training, strict divisions of labor, the quality controls they established contributed greatly to the city's success as an artistic center. They were also central to social life within the town. Only after long years of training and journeyman experience in a specific trade could the aspiring apprentice attain full mastership and the right to run his own workshop. And only on gaining the status of master, and it was always a he, was he permitted to marry and to hold any kind of political office. In other words, male sexual, social, and political adulthood was entirely predicated upon the attainment of craft excellence. You had to be good at something to marry, can you imagine? or to hold political office. So the family workshop, headed by a master of a craft, formed the kernel of an economic system in which familial and political bonds of community were dependent entirely upon professional craft expertise. Now, one of the important aspects of this was, unlike today's trade unions, which have largely replaced the guilds in the regulation and working conditions, the craft guilds' interest towards the work of their members was essentially proprietary rather than commercial or monetary. In their hands lay the responsibility of making value judgments, of exercising exacting standards of practice and of skill that could make them reject, often in very brutal terms, the work of aspiring journeymen and apprentices. It ensured, though, the maintenance of exceptional standards of practical skill, which consequently remained one of the leading values in any evaluation of the arts and crafts. Now, this rough characterization remains broadly true for the economies of many urban centers that flourished in the pre-modern era. The same ideal can be seen in the account of Nuremberg artists and craftsmen by Johannes Neuberger, whose portrait you see here, who wrote notes on artists and craftsmen in 1547. This was one of the very first accounts of craftsmen written in the north. Now, Neudorfer himself was a successful and influential modiste, that's to say a master of scribe, of writing, of different kinds of hand. He was also a teacher of mathematics. And like von Stetten, his understanding of craft was deeply bound up with a civic-minded sense of what these practitioners had contributed to Nuremberg's economic prosperity and reputation abroad. This well-known portrait of him by Nicolas Neufchâtel, 1561, shows him not as the professional craftsman scribe, but actually as in his role as a teacher of mathematics, pointing out the principles of geometric construction to a pupil. The portrait emphasizes his understanding of Platonic geometry. The polyhedron that he's actually made and is showing is the dodecahedron. Of all the solids of Euclidean geometry, the most complex mathematically and thus to construct. Another portrait of his very close friend, the eminent goldsmith Wenzel Jamnitzer, painted by Neufchâtel at exactly the same time, also emphasizes the craftsman as a learned inventor of measuring devices rather than as a goldsmith per se. He was famous for beautifully refined casts in silver of plants and lizards and things from nature, which you can see in the background vase. But what is emphasized are instruments that he actually invented. One is a slide rule for measuring the relative weight per volume of different metals needed in the execution of vessels and sculptures and so forth. The other is a pair of compasses, measuring device that he was proud to have invented. He too was deeply interested in mathematics. In 1569, he published a treatise on the Platonic Solids, relating the 5 perfect forms of Euclidean geometry to the elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and the quintessence, the heavenly element, so as it was understood, but revealing a practical engagement with Platonic philosophy and explicitly basing his treatise on Plato's Timaeus. The deep seriousness of, and these are his variations on a cube, which actually show the variations of the atomic structures of things, essentially. He's relating the cube to the element of earth. The deep seriousness of expression and bearing with which these sitters confront the world reveals a profound self-awareness of their role as learned craftsmen, the artifacts doctors, a type that had fully emerged by the 1550s as substantial, prominent citizen craftsmen profoundly engaged in the pursuits of practical learning. Jamnitzer and Neudorfer were working at a crucial moment in the development of craft consciousness at this time, a period running very roughly, 1540 to about 1630. It was a unique and relatively brief historical moment of exceptional creativity when the interests of a class of urban craftsmen like these two were increasingly educated, socially ambitious, inventive, intellectually curious, fired by the values of humanism, met the tastes and collecting habits of wealthy patrician and aristocratic patrons. In particular, it was the emergence around mid-century of a new type of collection, the Kunst- und Wunderkammer, the cabinet of art and wonder that gave momentum to the production of highly ambitious and novel kinds of craftwork. And I'd like to spend the rest of the talk exploring this phenomenon and its effects upon craft production. These collections, and I'm showing you an idealized one by Jan Bruegel the Elder, and Rubens actually did the figures, were broadly organized around an encyclopedic principle that saw in the manifold things collected a physical compendium of knowledge about the larger world. They were conceived as a theatre of wisdom, a system for organizing knowledge about the universe. And they comprised of mainly three categories: natural objects, naturalia, brought mostly back from the newly discovered worlds, the Americas, the Indies, and so on; artificial objects, artificialia, among which were scientific instruments, scientifica, that were both tools of contemporary scientific research and themselves examples of new cutting-edge technology. And the artificiula also included what you might call sort of useless things, things of no utility, but which often expressed deeply meditated themes, whose materials, forms, and iconography embodied or addressed broad areas of human knowledge and experience. This last category, the Kunststück, as it's known in contemporary documents, the work of art, or the demonstration piece actually, was a relatively new conception of what an object could be. To a large extent, it was born of the need of craftsmen to engage with the preoccupations of the Kunstkammer, above all with universal themes of human life, nature, and the cosmos. An important consequence of this was a gradual re-evaluation of the status of craft from an index of luxury or status to one of knowledge and learning. And this process may be followed through the work of a handful of city craftsmen who were working competitively within the orbit of the courts. Thomas Rucker, a sword maker from the court of Dresden, made this extraordinary monumental iron throne destined for the imperial collection of Emperor Rudolf II. It contains in every member arms, legs, back rails, small chiseled scenes that describe the entire course of Roman history, from Aeneas and the heroes of Troy at the base, rising through to the 16th century present, framed with an allegory of the four world empires and a Last Judgment scene. An iconography that's very rich and I can't go into it now, but when the emperor sat in it, he assumed into his person the entire course of Roman history. It was an extraordinarily symbolic, and the iron itself was associated with the last great empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So the metal, the material itself is symbolic of his rule. In 1572, the eminent Augsburg instrument maker Christoph Schissler wrote to the Elector August Duke of Saxony, offering a range of specialized goods, including terrestrial astronomical globes, astrolabes, planispheres. But besides practical instruments, he offered more purely conceptual showpieces, such as this so-called clock of Ashaz, which could actually literally make time go backwards. It followed the biblical narrative in the Book of Kings, in which God, as a sign to King Ashaz, caused the shadows to retreat a full 10 hours backwards in time. The point is, such works were demonstrations of knowledge and skill. In the case of Schissler's time-stopping piece, a virtuoso application of astronomical, geographical, and mathematical knowledge, and exacting mathematical construction as well, used to reenact the mechanics of a biblical miracle. So set within the Kunstkammer, between the objects of the natural world, the instruments of practical knowledge, such Kunststücke served as objects of contemplation, as material interventions into the world of the intellect, human knowledge, and ideas. So the last part of this talk I want to devote to the development of one particular object type, a completely new artistic form that was born of this new culture of collecting. And this was the Kunstschrank, or art cabinet, that was purpose-made to contain collectibles and other small works of art, a miniature, in fact, of the larger Kunstkammer. The early examples were constructed in intarsia, which we see here, itself a newly developed technique of surface decoration made by the intricate patterning of differently figured, grained, and textured woods. In the process, the makers created an entirely new visual language that had no equivalence in the other visual media of the period. The heightened attention which the technique lent its material base, the insistent presence of the wood medium, that creates an almost tactile play between the sectioned wooden pieces and what is actually represented, also produced new and unique conceptual and aesthetic possibilities, in effect a different aesthetic order. And beyond the singularity of technique and this novel interplay of medium and representation, these designs also displayed a distinctive visual language, completely original, which combined naturalistic landscape settings, ruins, and abstract geometric forms, often rendered as startling pieces of perspectival construction. So the interest in maths is demonstrated through these pieces too. These qualities, I think, are beautifully illustrated in this example. It's the so-called Rangelschrank. It's dated 1566, and it's today in the Landesmuseum in Münster. The box-like form, let's just go back, opens to reveal a two-storied, double-columned facade like a Roman temple. You can see half of it there. It encloses arched doors decorated with carved scenes of famous Roman battles, all meticulously labeled. And behind those, the drawers and shelves where you would store your collectibles. By contrast, these outer panels are entirely covered in rich intarsia scenes of an almost surreal complexity, tortured landscapes of ruination, depicting the disintegrating remains of ancient buildings, choked with the encroaching weeds and plant life, and scattered with strange scrolling ornamental forms, and so on. If we get a detail of the foreground, you see a series of different elements: putti asleep against shattered fragments of classical torsos, rearing horses, a looming vase of flowers, a turkey, a very rare sight in 1566 in Europe. In fact, it's based on the very first representation of a turkey in Northern Europe. A crouching isle, all these things interweave in a kind of medley of forms and emblems according to a wayward poetic logic, quite indifferent to logical scale relationships or narrative coherence. The outer panels, in contrast to the interior scenes of human history, turn upon a vision of the world strangely voided of human presence, implied only in the broken remains scattered in a restless realm of nature. They constitute this original form of visual poetics. So this is intarsia workers completely rewriting the visual language of the time in many ways. What is its meaning? Well, behind the cabinet's outer and inner states, there's a broad symbolism of human transience. The outer image of time's destruction surrounds and envelops, and the inner spectacle of past Roman greatness, referenced in the battle scenes and the ordered architectural facade. It's a fitting conceit for an object that housed collectibles, ancient coins, cameos, and other curiosities, by which the historical past is literally enclosed, swallowed up, as it were, by the process of its own dissolution. It would have prompted appropriate reflections upon the pathos of time's passage and the evanescence of earthly fame and achievement in the manner of the Vanitas allegories, such as Bruegel's Kunstkammer piece that I showed you earlier. And here you can see one of those cabinets prominently placed on the side. In fact, the imagery of the Rangelschrank works in a manner very similar to that of the Bruegel, and indeed of the display of the Kunstkammer. That is to say, meanings, poetic, historical, philosophical, aesthetic, are generated not by any precise matching of a signifier to a specific signified, but rather by an elusiveness of suggested meaning, by juxtaposition of jostling fragments drawn from different cultural registers, of variety and density that are used as a kind of means of intensification. These are rhetorical methods applied here in the Rangelschrank in visual ornamental terms that Walter Benjamin found employed in the structures of Baroque literary tragedy, the Trauerspiel, methods which work in both literary and visual genres to similar effects of pathos, melancholy, and a sense of loss attached to the historical. The Rangel-Schrank's imagery and its functions as repository mirrored quite precisely then the larger spaces of the Kunstkammer. And I want to talk a bit about the cumulative effect of these objects in that space. The cumulative effect of demonstrative works of this kind, I'll go back to that slide, made in many different media, including metalwork, hardstones, automata, sculptures, jewelry, and so on, which jostled for attention amid a welter of like objects, and which trafficked so promiscuously in materials, form language, imagery, and themes, was that it encouraged an exhilarating heterodoxy of thinking. Such variety of theme and means of transmission required viewers to draw upon and cross-reference their own reservoirs of learning in theology, history, literature, natural philosophy, mathematics, and so on. And it prompted, as Philipp Heinhofer, the dealer and commissioner of Kunstkabinette, like this, as he said, in German, schöne Meditation und Contemplationes, or noble meditations and contemplations. So how can we access how people received these things? Well, the astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler provides evidence for precisely the flexible, genre-crossing faculty of mind that I want to suggest the Kunstkammer encouraged. On a visit to the collections of the Dresden court, he recounted seeing, quote, a panel of silver ore from which a dodecahedron the size of a small hazelnut blossomed forth so it half stood out. Now, he remembered this some 10 years later when probing the question as to why in nature organized forms from seemingly shapeless, organized forms, crystals, arise from seemingly shapeless inchoate matter. This discussion occurs in Kepler's treatise on the six-sided snowflake, which he presented as a New Year's gift to his friend and patron at Prague, the wonderfully named Johannes Matthäus Wacker von Wackenfels, in 1610. The work addressed the question of why snowflakes, the tiniest and most insignificant and evanescent of forms, are always regular, six-sided, and flat. Kepler's ensuing search led him to seek patterns and analogies with other kinds of natural structures, including the honeycomb, the inside of a pomegranate, the clustered crystal formations that miners were extracting from the earth, and the geometry of the 5 Platonic solids. His discussion of the latter parallels Jamnitz's understanding that underlies the geometrics of the intarsia panels too, because like Jamnitzer, he was alive to the belief in a correspondence between mathematical truth and the forms of nature. He took seriously the notion that the pentagon, whose 5 sides are constructed by means of the golden section, itself derived from a self-generating numerical series, could therefore be inherently imbued with a procreative faculty. He was trying to explain mathematically the processes of growth in nature. Ultimately, none of these speculative theories satisfied him, and he abandoned his search to chemists, interestingly. But the point is, the spirit of the exercise was less the pursuit of truth in a strictly logical Cartesian sense, but rather a kind of intellectual fireworks display, of looking for patterns and parallels across categories and borders of things. And we can see how this playful and immensely wide-ranging entertainment, really, which created a universe of ideas out of a thing of such tiny compass, mirrored the structure, contents, and operations of the Kunstkammer. As he exclaims at one point, for from this almost nothing, the snowflake, I have nearly recreated the entire universe, which contains everything. Am I now to present the orb of the earth in a tiny atom of snow? All this is to say that for the period of its flourishing, the Kunststück, ultimately this craft piece, offered up for contemplation and appreciation a set of technical and intellectual skills that suggested new means, formal and aesthetic, by which to describe experience, how to evaluate it, and at its best, how to imagine its transformation. For those patrons and members of their circle like Kepler, who engaged in their evaluation, these supreme works of craft modelled the liberating way in which the world itself might be remade. In an important way, therefore, the Kunststück, the craft work, stood as an emblem of the larger creativity that characterized the culture of the Renaissance, as well as the centrality of the craft economy within it. Thanks very much. And you're probably all dying for it, but there's details for lunch.
All right, so I'm going to invite our panel up here. You want to come up and grab a seat? I have nothing to say here other than I thought that was fantastic. Thank you to all of you. I thought that was a wonderful set of papers individually and collectively, and I will throw things open to audience question and discussion.
So I have a question for Andrew, which is how can you talk about the craft of the cabinets without talking about the violent erasures of colonization that produced the cabinet?
Thank you, it's a very good question. Those intarsia cabinets are actually local woods, largely. They're fruit woods. There's some walnut that might have been imported from Italy. But they aren't the ebony cabinets, of course, that did depend on colonialization, and so on. That's why.
I don't think the question's about the wood. I think it's about the content of
What's being collected and what's being lost so that these beautifully crafted cabinets in Europe can then collect the artifacts of
I see, yeah.
cultures that are being changed and dominated through that process. What is craft's implication in this colonial
Yes, that's your point is very well taken. There is, of course, a background of military domination, economic domination of the other continents, the Americas and the India and so on, which is undeniable, yes. Thank you. I mean, I would simply say that's not my main focus. The focus is really on craft and knowledge, really.
So I wanted to thank you all, first of all, for, I have to say, one of the best panels I have seen in many, along something. The most diverse and the best articulated arguments, I think. So just thank you for that. And I think my question is primarily for Greg. As I was watching your presentation and listening to both of you speak, I was wondering if the way that you actually work with the clay, the way that you form, changed at all based on the discoveries you were making about the bones or your way of thinking about them. Because I was really fascinated, looking at your vessels, I was really fascinated about their actual forms and curious about how you make them. And if you feel like that process of making has any relation to the changes in the clay body.
Yeah.
It's funny, that's the slide we left out.
I knew there was something.
Yeah, it's an impossible material with which to work.
Yeah.
It's so difficult. Partly because there's so little clay in it. Clay is what makes clay bodies malleable.
Can you speak up?
I'm sorry? Speak up. Yeah. So it's difficult to work with, and I had to invent. It's taken 3 years. I had to invent new processes to make these things. Of course, on an industrial scale, you can make anything out of bone china. This bone china in particular is funky. So scale is a limitation, and I don't work from. I tend to work from having an idea and then seeing how to execute it, and then the environment limitations, this is like evolutionary biology, on that idea help shape the piece, but it's really driven by the idea. And the whole thing started with a failure. And there are steps along the way where, at the moment, I only make a little plate, a bowl, and the cup that you saw. But that's also what the chef uses, right? So if I make something that's incredibly beautiful but useless, or doesn't have an application in the kitchen in the restaurant, it's got no meaning, right? There's no reason for it being. So how I make, it's like, it's not, I don't use traditional methods. I sort of make up my own methods to make things. But the cup itself is slip cast. And slip casting is a process by which you take a liquid ceramic body and pour it into a mold made out of plaster. The mold absorbs the liquid at different rates depending on that fluid. And so typically when I slip cast things in porcelain, I cast it for about 8 minutes for a wall that's of decent thickness. The bone china casts for 3 seconds.
Okay, I'm glad I asked.
It's like magic.
Yeah, it hurt getting there though. Thank you.
Other questions?
Andrew, I appreciate what you're doing, and my concern is the colonial implications of those things. So I got you. Don't worry. I wanted to know about some of the times when you may have objects that you don't know who made them. I mean, because first of all, you've got the spectacular portraits of the very well-known craftsmen or artists, but then there might be a lot of objects in the Kunsthammers that you don't know where they came from, and they've moved because there's a lot of movement around Europe, and people are exchanging, and artisans are going to different places to make for different courts. So, what does that make any difference in what you do, or how do you work around that?
It does, and anonymity goes with craft, as we heard actually at the round table last night as well. It speaks to workshop hierarchies and so on and so forth. There's a lot of people working for the Yamnitzer firm, and he is a brand, without a doubt. And many of those journeymen who didn't make master would end up working in his shop, as assistant, effectively, often very very skilled. The guild records, the council records, the archives of the cities are basically where you find the names. So, for instance, Christoph Schissler, who made that sort of clock that goes backwards, he took on a clockmaker from a different town called Martin Pfeil to design an odometer, he was commissioned by the Duke of Saxony to make this thing that measured distance. They hadn't been made since Vitruvius, since antiquity. So he's making this very, and Pfeil is really good, and basically is the person behind the thing, but it's signed Schissler and so on. And Pfeil takes to become a master in Augsburg, he has to apply and produce a masterpiece. So he wanted to use this thing as his masterpiece. So he takes it to the council, and they say, "Get lost. You're under contract to Schissler. If you go away with your fine object." I'm quoting literally. If you don't want to fulfill your contract, so he gets lost to history until that court case is excavated from the archives. But they are there to be found, and their stories are to be told.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about how these 3 panels struck me as like there was an ideal underlying each situation. So it's like the ideal oyster or the ideal ingredient or even the ideal picture of knowledge of the world, but also a lot of messy practicalities. So I was curious about how the role of craft in mediating the sort of ideal picture of the world, but then also having to solve a lot of really practical problems on a day-to-day basis, and if you could reflect on how that plays out in your material.
I can, right? Because the objects themselves, when they come out of the kiln, are really white and look pure. The process is disgusting, right? Getting bones to turn into bone china is gross and
Fire
dirty.
Comes every time.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of, I don't want to spend too long because I just mentioned this, but in the process we learn and take new directions. And so we've started on another project because of something cool that happened in the kiln that if we hadn't actually done the labor, it wouldn't have led to the idea. So while I say that ideas lead to labor in my work, there's reciprocity there. There's a relationship where labor sometimes leads to ideas.
And in my work, we talk about evolvability as a property of a species, and it's underlined by diversity. Without diversity, there is no adaptation, there is no new form to come, and the form that you have today may not work down the road, and we can't predict how that's going to play out. And so we've been exploring diversity and embracing it, and one of the offshoots of this study is taking our specimen collection of different skeletons from animals, all different kinds of animals, from vultures to fish and turtles, and testing them in the kiln and looking for their effects on bone china. Who knows what the best bone china is going to be? It might be dolphin.
Not ground.
Well, the references to process and the awfulness of it is definitely alluded to in autobiographical accounts of the periods, like Cellini, for instance, is the hero, the artist hero who's sort of grappling with recalcitrant matter, and fire, and as a goldsmith and so on. But it's always in a kind of heroic mode, overcoming the difficulties and so on. The collections themselves, the Kunstkammer, often juxtapose the finished works with the raw materials. And, to quote again contemporary inventory descriptions, the juices of the earth were among the things that had to be displayed. So there was an idea of process and the intractability of the original matters, often implicit in the way they were displayed. It's not quite an answer, but yeah. It's usually cloaked in rather heroic terms. Jamnitz, in his introduction to his mathematical treatise, says, "I've laboured for 40 years with the hard and tough work of goldsmithing, and have learned mathematics on the side, and this is my true interest," which is interesting. So there is this contrast.
I think we probably have time for maybe one more question if we're to stay more or less on schedule.
Mine's just a quick comment, but I just wanted to appreciate the idea that the former panel and this panel is full of the craft of research and the craft of exploring history and looking in archives, and that I really appreciate that, and that we should be valuing the craft of what everyone is doing in that regard as well.
Well, in fact, building on that point, like we think across the second and the final papers, in some sense, what you see is it causes us to reflect on this separation that we now draw, right, between craft and research, because clearly at the time that you're speaking, and now what you guys are again doing, both of those worlds are entwined in ways that our stories about them don't actually fully account for. I think, should we wrap up? And
Just to, again, so housekeeping things, we're gonna break for lunch, and we'll reconvene here back at 2:30. In your program, there are some suggestions for places to go and eat around here. But honestly, if you go west, go out the building, turn left, and either go up or down Columbus, or go one more block and go up and down Amsterdam, you will find food. And if you are a quick eater or do not need sustenance, you also could go turn right and go to our gallery down the street and see the Agents of Faith exhibition, which is really wonderful. We'll see you back here at 2:30.